Welcome to the Excel review session. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the important concepts in Excel, and I'm going to be using the review package that's posted on Learn as a guide. So I'm going to start off by reviewing some of the important functions that you've learned throughout the term. And this by no means is an exhaustive list. You can find a list of all the functions that you need to know on Learn under the final exam information folder. So we're going to start off by looking at the VLOOKUP function, and the VLOOKUP function searches the leftmost column of a table for a value that you specify, and it returns a value in the matching row for the column that you specify. So if you take a look over here, here we have the four parameters of the VLOOKUP function, and the order of these parameters does matter. So we start off by the lookup value, which is the value that we're looking for, and then we have the table array, followed by the column that we want to return, and the range lookup, which can either be true or false, depending on whether you want the function to return an exact match or an inexact match. So if you take a look at the quick example that we have here, we have VLOOKUP 36, so that's the search key, the value that we're looking for. This is the table array, that's the column number, and false. And when we specify false, it means we're looking for an exact match. Something that we commonly do and that you've learned throughout the term is the importance of naming ranges. So in this case, we would name this range something like jobs, and then we would use that name here in place of the table array. And so what that does is it creates an array that is used, that is referred to when you drag the formula down or across. The next function on the review package is the indirect function. What the indirect function does is it takes in a label as its parameter, and it treats that label as if it were a cell address. So there is only one parameter for the indirect, and that is the cell label that you want to turn into the cell address. So if you look at this example here, we have indirect A2, so it treats A2 as a cell address and returns the contents of A2, which is B2, but it automatically evaluates that and returns the word yes. And we're going to look at some examples of indirect a little later on. The next function that I want you to just to refresh your memory with is the concatenate function. And the concatenate function is a function that is used to join several text items into one text item, and alternatively you can use the ampersand as a short form of doing it. So here's a quick example that shows you how to join the values in three different cells together to form a single phrase. The next quite important function is the if function, and like the name suggests, what the if function does is it is used when you want to display or calculate a value that is conditional on information in the spreadsheet. So the parameters for the if function are, first you have the logical test. So in this example here, we're checking to see if A1 is greater than 6. Then we have the action to be taken if the test is met. So if the value is true, here's the action that we want to take, and if the value is false, here's the action that we want to take. So in this quick example here, we have A1 greater than 6, but in A1 we see is 4, which is not greater than 6. So we evaluate the false condition, which is B1 times B3, which is 4 times 4, which is 9 times 6, which is 54. So hopefully that refreshes your memory on the if function. Next is the COUNTIF. COUNTIF, quite similar. All it does is it counts the number of cells that meet a given criteria. So here's a quick example. Another source of confusion sometimes is between the COUNTIF and the SUMIF function. So please make sure you look up the difference between COUNTIF and SUMIF. And finally, the last function that we're going to be using in this review package is the mid function. And the mid function is one of the text functions. And what it does is it extracts a specific number of characters from a string starting at the position that you specify. So in this case here, we want to extract from the string in A3, which is the word Smith. Here we have the starting position, which is 1, so we're starting from S, and we want to extract 3 characters, so we go SMI. So those are the 3 characters that are returned by the mid function. So hopefully that sort of served as a reminder to you. The next thing that we want to look at is the differences between a cell, a relative cell address, and an absolute cell reference. So an example of a relative cell address would be A5. So in this case, when we drag it across or we drag it down, the value changes. So if we drag it to the next column, column B, the cell reference will be B5, and if we drag it down, the cell reference will be A6. So that's an example of and that's used in functions and formulas where you want the value of the cell reference to change. An absolute cell reference, in contrast, is one where neither the column nor the row changes. So when I drag it down, this cell reference $A $5, if I drag it down, it's still going to be $A $5, and when I drag it across, it's going to be $A $5. So no change there. And a mixed cell reference, of course, is a combination of 2 of them, where either we want the column to change or we want the row to change. The second part of this question asks why it is useful to name particular cells or ranges. And as outlined in your modules and in the various assignments, it is useful to name cells or ranges because it makes it easier for users of your spreadsheet to use and understand what the spreadsheet is doing. And another advantage of using name cells is by default a name reference is absolute. So if you name a cell reference or a range, it's absolute and the value does not change when it is copied or spread throughout other cells. So that was sort of an introduction to get. So here we have the example of a Fed's swag sale, and the first thing to do is when you're presented with a question like this is to read through the description and try to make connections with what's on the screenshot. So here we have a table that has the various clothing types and the prices, both an early bird price, a regular price. The early bird price is dependent on what the value is in the early bird date column. Here we have a volunteer discount, and we have all the other information that's presented in the paragraph. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to name cells, but as it says here, naming cells is easier when once we actually work through the questions. So we'll start with the first one. It says in cell F14, indicate whether the student receives a free pair of Malibu sunglasses. And if you read the description or even the screenshot here, we can see that a student receives a free pair of Malibu sunglasses whenever he or she purchases a combo, an HCT combo. So the first thing is, as we speak out, or rather as we word out what the question asks of us, we automatically recognize that we have to use an if statement in this question here. So we start with using if. Now the 3 parameters of if, again, first is the logical condition, and our condition is whether or not the student has ordered an HCT combo. So we look at cell E14. And we check whether it equals HCT combo. So if cell E14 equals HCT combo, we write the word yes, and we have to remember to put quotation marks because this is not a cell reference, it's a label. And if this condition is not met, we use the word no. So that's a very simple application of the if statement. In the next question, G14, we have to display the volunteer discount to be applied. And again, the volunteer discount is applied whether or not the student is a volunteer. So again, we have a condition that has to be met, so we use an if statement again. Here the condition is if C14 is yes, so if the student is a volunteer, we apply the discount. Now, instead of using the cell reference, as we would usually do, we name the cell that has the discount. We name it discount, and we have to specify which cell it is. It's the cell G5. So discount is G5, and we can use that name here in the formula itself. So if the student is a volunteer, we apply the discount, or else we leave it 0. Notice over here, we don't need to put quotation marks because 0 is a number. In part D, we have to find the purchase price that is paid by the student, taking into account both the early bird discount as well as the volunteer discount. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to check what type of clothing or what clothing type the student has purchased. And to do that, we have to use a VLOOKUP function here. So we are looking up E14, that's the clothing type. The second parameter of the VLOOKUP function is the table array. As I mentioned before, we have to name the table array, and we're going to name the table array swag. And the range that corresponds to is A6 to C9. Sorry. So A6 to C9 is the range. So coming back to the formula here, our table array is swag. Now, the column to be returned, we know we have two possible columns that can be returned, either the early bird price or the regular price, depending on the date that the student has made the purchase. So again, since we have a condition to be met, we use an if statement here. And if D14 is less than or equal to the early bird price, so again, since the early bird price the early bird date is a date that does not change as we drag the formula down, we are going to name that. We're going to call it early bird, and the cell reference for that is G4. So now we use that in the formula here. So if D14 is less than or equal to early bird, notice that this is an underscore here, not a hyphen. So if it is equal to less than or equal to early bird, we return column 2, which is the early bird price, or else we return column 3, which is the regular price. So that concludes our if statement. However, our VLOOKUP is not yet complete because we're missing one parameter, and that is whether we want it to be true or false. So we want it to be an exact match, so we write false. And now don't forget that we have to take into account the volunteer discount, which we already calculated in G14. So we can use that here and do minus G14. So what this formula is going to do is it's going to look into this table, pick out the appropriate price, early bird or regular, and then take into account the volunteer discount. So if there's a volunteer discount, it's going to be subtracted. And that's what we do down here. So this is an example of a slightly more involved formula, but it's pretty easy once you understand what is really going on. The next question is we want to summarize the purchases made in cells B26 to B29. So we want to enter a formula in B26 that when filled down to B29 displays the number of purchases made. So again, here we want to count something. So let's ignore that. We're going to use the count if function because we want to count something based on a condition, and the condition here is whether the clothing type matches A26. So I'm going to call the clothing type, and I'm going to go up here and define what that cell reference is. So I'm going to write up here type, and the cells that reference that are E14 to E22. So that's an example of the count if function. Moving on, we have part F, where we have to summarize the purchase made by each faculty. So again, for the purposes of this question here, I'm going to go back up here and name a certain range. I'm going to name the range B14 to B22. And I'm going to name that faculty. And then I'm going to use that name in this formula down here, where again it's a count if function, similar to the one that we had prior, except here instead of matching to the type, we match to the faculty. Sorry, and that's G26. Part G, what we have to do is we have to keep a track of the number of sunglasses that are remaining in stock after each purchase. So for this question, I'm going to go back up and I'm going to name another range. And I'm going to name the range F14 to F22. And I'm going to use that name here in the formula that keeps track of the number of sunglasses that are remaining. So the formula here would be, since we start with 100 sunglasses, it's going to be 100 minus, and again here we have the count if function, which we're already quite familiar with. So we want to count the range F14 to F22, and we want it to match the word yes. Right. So now we move on to some more easier sections of this question. We have to identify the type of chart used in this spreadsheet, and the type of chart used is a pie chart. The corresponding data range for this chart is G26 to H31. And now we have a bit of analysis to do in terms of keeping track of what changes in the spreadsheet if a particular student changes their faculty. So we have to go through the spreadsheet here and identify what columns change when the faculty is changed. So we notice that B17 changes, B17 being the faculty, of course. So B17 changes, the range G26 to H31, which is the tally by faculty, that changes. And also it's important to note that the pie chart changes, because the pie chart depends on the items purchased by faculty. And part K is something that's straight from your modules, where you have to analyze how the design of the spreadsheet, or evaluate the design of the spreadsheet based on the principles that are outlined in module 3.3. So some of those include proximity, separation, alignment, the overall layout, the use of colors, fonts, things like that. Now we're going to move on to the next question, which is indirect. So here we're going to have a little practice with using indirect. So this question here, we have a screenshot and we have to answer these particular questions. So here we have a formula and we sort of have to evaluate what this formula returns. So I'm going to just start with evaluating this portion of the indirect function. So in this case, we're concatenating. Notice we have the ampersand here. So that tells us we need to concatenate. All right, so we're concatenating B, just the letter B, along with D2 plus 1. And D2 is a cell reference. Notice it doesn't have quotation marks, which indicates that it's a cell reference. D2 contains the value 6, and we're adding 1 to that. So this would be 6 plus 1, 7. So what is inside this now is actually B7. And we have indirect before that, so it's indirect B7. And what that does is it goes into B7 and returns the value that is in B7. So that's what E2, what would be displayed in E2. So E2 would give us what the value is in B7. And the same exercise can be applied because when we drag this formula down, notice that D2 is a relative cell reference. So it changes as we drag it down. So in row 3, it's going to be D3. In row 4, it's going to be D4, and so on. When you reach row 6, it's going to be D6 plus 1. D6 is 7, and 7 plus 1 is 8. So this is going to give you what is in B8, which is the word tree. Following the same process, we can find that E7 returns the word not, and E8 returns the word pair. So that's sort of the level of difficulty, or at the level of difficulty that you can expect with regards to using the indirect function. The indirect function can be a bit confusing, but this is the level that we would be requiring from you. Moving on to some questions that use text functions. So here we have a screenshot, and we want to enter a formula in C2 that would display the full name as depicted in the screenshot. So here, of course, we have their first name, we have the last name, and we have the full name. This is what we're trying to replicate. So we start our function, of course, we start our formula using something that can extract. And in fact, in part A, we don't really have to extract anything because we already have the first name and the last name. We just have to put them together using the concatenate function or using the ampersand operator. So here we have A2. Notice that we have a space in between. We have a space in between. A space is a character, so we leave an empty space that gets enclosed in quotation marks, and B2. So that would give us the full name. Enter a formula in D2 that generates a code as follows. So now we're focusing on generating this code, and the question tells us how to find the code. We have to find the first initial of the first name. So let's do that first. So to extract the first initial of the first name, we use mid. Now, you looking over here, we can see the parameters of mid. The first one is the text that we're looking at. So we're looking at A2, the first name. We want to start at position 1 and extract one character. So that gives us the first initial of the first name, followed by the length of the last name. So we're going to concatenate that. To find the length, we use the len function. The last name is in B2. And then finally, we have to follow that by the first initial of the last name. So the last name is found in B2. Again, we want to start from position 1 and extract one character. So that is sort of combining mid and len together. Now we want to enter a formula in E2 that creates the rearranged version of the name. So we want to have the first name initial, we want to have a period, we want to have a space, and then followed by the last name. So again, to extract the first name initial, we follow the same steps we followed previously. And now we have to have a period and a space. So we have a period here, we have a space after it, and then we close the quotation marks. And we have the last name, which is in B2. So that concludes the Excel portion. You can also find the videos for all the other sections. Thanks for watching, and good luck on the exam.